Hey guys, welcome to Sketch-A-Day. I'm Spencer and I'm excited. I'm going to try something a little different today. We're going to do some landscape drawing. But before we begin, I want you to hit that subscribe button, turn on alerts, and you can also find me on Instagram at sketchaday.com. Be sure to check out sketchaday.com/newsletter where you'll be able to sign up for my newsletter and get this free super sketch tip guide, which is a collection of knowledge that I've had over the years that I wanted to share with you guys, and that's a free downloadable PDF, so be sure to sign up for that. So we're going to be using markers, marker paper, and all that good stuff. All the links will be below in the video description, so you'll want to check that out. So with that, let's get started. So I've got this pad of marker paper, 11 by 17, and I'm going to try and follow as best as possible the rule of thirds here, meaning as I divide this scene, I'm going to try and map out my colors in thirds. So this will be mostly sky with some ground as well. So let's start with the sky tone. And much like I would with any marker drawing, I'm going to start light until I get it right. So here I've got my marker ink. I'm using a Copic Blue 01. I also have some colorless blender I can throw onto this to make things a little bit lighter as well. And fair warning, this might get a little bit messy, but in my head, I think it works. So I've got my colorless blender and my blue, and roughly about a third of the way down here, I'm just going to start building up. So we've got our blue, add some more blue here to my cotton swabs. That's what I'm using. And we're just going to build up value moving up the page. Keep it fairly light going down. Okay, just like we would any kind of painting or so forth. I also have this blue 05, which is going to be a little bit darker than I want, but it should work okay. A couple drops of blender on this as well. And we'll start at the top here and start to get a nice dark tone toward the top of the drawing, because if you go outside and look at the sky, you'll notice that things are a little bluer the further up you move your sight line, if you will. Okay, so we've got some nice blue on the paper, and now I want to get my earth tones down. Fortunately, I do have some earth tone ink that I can use. I've got this E35, but I also have this E33 that I can use as well. So here's where I can kind of map out, maybe some sort of horizon line with the marker, like so. And with my E35, start to create a little bit of a gradient as we come closer to, so just like this, nice tones. So we have roughly roughly thirds going up the page as far as creating this scene. Now, what I want to do here is now establish where other elements might fall on the page. So if I just get a pencil for my kit here, I can start to map out some things. So for example, if I feel like there should be some sort of rock or something in the front, I can lightly kind of map that out with my pencils. We'll add some mountains to the background as well, clouds and so forth, but I kind of want to map out where these are. And using my E33, I'm going to just fill in where I feel like maybe some of these rock formations might be. Framing up my scene a bit, okay? Just like so. Maybe even carrying some of those lines on some of these features through to the front, like so, just like that. Okay, so now we have some earth tones, we have our sky tone as well, and we can start to build up the value in the other, value contrast rather, in other parts of the drawing. And to do that, I'm going to use my earth tone markers, which I do have here with me. We'll be using gouache as well, paint. So this will be a little bit more involved of a marker drawing than you might be used to seeing here, but I'm fairly confident at the potential outcome here. I've never actually done one of these, so you guys are seeing this live. So I want to try and use a little less saturated color or tone on this. So I'm going to be looking at browns or earth tones that are more neutral. And for that, I need to kind of lean into my warm grays a little bit for some of this shading. So here I have warm 6, warm 4, and warm 5. I'll start with the 5 and 6. And this way, you know, if I need to go a little bit darker, I can as well. Okay, so just coming in, introducing a bit of shadow, right? If the light's coming from this way, maybe these are the sides of our formations here that are receiving most of the shadow. We might have some shadow cast on the ground as well here in this section, like so. A couple lines going through. Okay, keeping it on the same side away from the sun as we're drawing this, and keeping it fairly random. We do want to try and capture some of the rock quality that you might find in these natural formations. So always helpful to kind of refer to images, or if you have pictures, it's another good way to kind of know where to put your tones and where things are going to make the most sense in terms of your shadows and so forth. So that's something that I like to say is you also need to draw from observation if you're going to be drawing from your imagination. So definitely something you kind of want to look into as you are being creative with your visualizations, illustrations, and so forth. Again, not something I do typically, but thought we'd give this a try, and so far it's looking pretty good. So keep building up that shadow as we go. If you have cool gray, that's okay. You can also use cool grays to do this. As I go through this, I'm imagining, you know, maybe there's some sort of cattle fencing or something. So we can bring that from the background a little bit further into the foreground, perhaps, like so. And because this is in perspective, we want to make sure that we are communicating scale, right, as we do this. So as I have, for example, these fence posts that I'm kind of mapping out in my gray here, we just want to make sure that we're representing some scale, meaning the distance between these is getting closer together as we move further out. Okay, because things further apart are going to appear smaller and smaller in scale and so forth. So that's something that you'll want to pay attention to, is the scale at which you present certain things in your drawings. And we'll come back in and touch up some of this stuff here as well, just to make sure we have the right, you know, contrast elements and so forth. But essentially, the scale is going to help reinforce the idea of perspective, how much there is in the drawing, and so forth. Now that I'm feeling better about the gray here, I'm going to take just an even darker gray. This is a warm gray 9, and I can make some of these shadows a bit crisper, particularly where we have our lightest lights. Okay, so a few deliberate strokes right where we're going to get some good shadow happening in some of these formations, for example, like so. Also a good way to do this is by being a little erratic, but also purposeful in your strokes. Okay, so what I mean is you want to kind of keep this a little random, but also make sure that you're kind of following your initial plan in terms of how you envisioned your shadows. Okay, so if you're using reference and so forth, again, always work lightest lights to darkest darks. It's going to save you a lot of headache in the long run. Okay, so also with our fence that we're kind of shading in here, we're going to have, you know, a little more intensity and color, detail, and all that up front. So I want to make sure I'm capturing that in these posts. Okay, the contrast is going to play really nicely against our lighter tones in the foreground as well. And as we move back, I may switch to a 70% gray and so forth as we move back here. Now on this side of the formation, like I said, I want to make sure there's some good shadowing. Maybe the shadow is being cast into our little quasi valley here. So I'm going to bring some of this darker tone down. If it's helpful for you, one thing I like to do is kind of squint my eyes as I'm drawing. And the reason for that is it helps me focus on the value of what I'm doing and less so on the details of what I'm doing. Okay, so if you haven't done that before, try just squinting a little bit and you'll kind of see what I mean when you are able to kind of take a look at your drawing and just reduce the detail and focus on the contrast of what you're doing. All right, so I'm just going to dig around here a little bit for a cool gray. And the reason for that is I want to just make the background a little less saturated. Okay, right now it's pretty saturated. So I've got a cool gray 2, which is fairly light in terms of value. And just to kind of help with the blending, added some colorless blender here. And with this cool gray, I'm just going to wash over kind of the horizon line, okay? And in doing so, I'm able to kind of desaturate things a little bit, come back in with this blue, kind of hit it here. And now we have a nicer blend top to bottom with these inks. So colorless blender, pretty handy. If you don't have that, you can also use rubbing alcohol if it is what's the word, a high enough percentage. You can actually use that in your drawing to kind of help things out. Now at this point, we're just going to keep building up our values. You know, again, with marker, once it's dry, you can always hit the same spot a few times. So if you need to go darker, that's something you can do as you're drawing. Okay, so now that this is dried, I can come back over some of these dark spots here and make sure that I kind of have the right amount of shadow that I want to have. Or if there was a spot that I missed, I can always come back and hit that as well. All right, so just in the distance, I want to take like a nice warm gray marker here, like this warm gray 7, and with the brush tip, just introduce a couple lines going back, landscape lines. And that's just going to help give our background here some texture. A couple other ways you could do this. You could probably use a colored pencil if you want to kind of help things out. But I'm just using the marker here. And like I mentioned, with this warm gray, I can kind of touch up my fence. And we'll add a few things here as well, just to help out in our drawing. It's pretty warm in the front, which is what we want. We want cooler tones toward the back, more saturated up front as well. And our gouache is really going to help things pop a bit as we get to that point. Okay, here's our little fence line going back. Now, I do want something, so we have our drawing framed here by these rock formations, okay? And I do want there to be something in the foreground, something that just kind of establishes the scene, maybe helps frame in this side or that side. You know, you could start with bushes, that kind of thing. We'll pull out some greens to kind of help with that as well. But let's say we want something like a tree in. Now, like I always say, you want to work light until you get it right. So I'm going to start with this 40% gray and kind of map out where, you know, maybe this kind of desert or drier landscape tree might be hanging out. Maybe it's a little craggy, so forth, and it's got a couple little friends here as well. Happy trees, you might say. Okay, and maybe another one over here. Just kind of mapping out where I intend for things to be. And it's fairly light, so it's not really significantly impacting our drawing right now. But because it is in the foreground, I can now come in, here's a 70% gray, and really kind of define what it is I was trying to represent here. So again, some nice craggy looking tree things. Okay, maybe, like I said, it's a little bit drier. So we have less foliage and more kind of a dried out branch arrangement. If we want to add foliage, we can also use our gouache or more opaque medium to accomplish that. So that's certainly something we can do. If we have shrubs and so forth, we can start to kind of block in where some of these elements might be, or grasses, and that kind of thing. Okay, so something like that. And as you're composing this, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm like, oh, you know, it would be really cool if this kind of pierced into the blue of the horizon, like so. It kind of has a bit more presence, and I really like how that looks. So as you're drawing, don't constrain yourself solely to your initial sketch or even how you map things out. You can also change things as you go, but it's a lot easier if you just work light until you get it right. Okay, so always try and work light until you get it right, guys. It'll save you a lot of heartache if you're working through a design or an illustration and you're just trying to figure things out. It's a really great way to work, just in a very, very measured, thoughtful, non-destructive way. All right. So at this point, I'm going to continue to work on some of these details, maybe add a little bit of green and bolster our scene with some texture. So just light strokes with our gray markers here. You know, maybe there's some cattle or something off in the distance, buildings, could be anything, right? So just adding some stuff off in the distance here, like so. Continuing to kind of reinforce the rockiness of this scene, if you will, just with some detail lines. Now, you want to be careful where you put your detail, not too much in the background, because that's going to reduce the feeling of depth that you might have in your scene. So definitely want to be careful and aware of that, okay, as you're going. And we had our shadows that we were casting. So I'm going to make sure that these posts have a little shadow as well, and that our tree does on the ground. Okay, and just roughing that in. I'm trying to get the effect more than perfection for this shadow. Blocking in shapes, we'll add detail as necessary later, but just focusing on these silhouettes, okay? So craggy trees in the foreground, shadow, we've got some grasses, and so forth. So now I can start to take a little bit of green, and I've got a blue-green 96 and a yellow-green 3, because I just want to kind of introduce a little green tone, okay, just in the front here. It's not totally a desert. I'm going to blend our colors. So we have just a little bit of green up front, okay? And even how you shade with the marker can kind of help some of these tones come in. Now, let's say we do want to lighten up this central region for lighting. We want to have like maybe some light hitting these rocks. We want to have some clouds, and also just really help the scene pop a bit more. That's where we start to use things like colored pencil to help with that. So I'm going to break out my colored pencils. With these, I'll be able to lighten things up a bit. So for example, I have this cream colored pencil, and now in the central part of this scene, I can start to lighten things up, or on the rocks themselves in this formation, lighten things up here. And so starting with the marker allows me to start with my more translucent medium or media and work my way up to more opaque things, okay? Now, as much as you can, if you do put your lightest lights against your darkest dark, so notice what I'm doing with these these fence posts, for example, and some of the details on the tree, things will start to kind of pop in your drawing. Okay, even on this shadow region here of the rock, okay, just by lightening this up, it's going to help the contrast in the scene and help this feel a bit more three-dimensional, if you will. So that's something you want to try and pay attention to as much as you can. Lightest lights, darkest darks, and apply them in a way that pushes the contrast, okay, on your scene. Now, like I said, in the middle here, I want to lighten up the ground quite a bit. So by using my pencil in this way, trying to pay attention to the layers I initially created with my marker, and then work my way toward the front of the drawing, this is going to help kind of set up a lighting scene here for my value that I've created. Okay, so I just have a simple paintbrush with me today, and I'm going to use some artist gouache. Gouache is just a type of paint. It's a bit more opaque and allows me to kind of cover things up if you're using like a marker or anything like that. This one's not actually open, so I gotta pop this one open. But you will see that with my gouache here, here's a little bit of this yellow gouache. I can actually come in on my rocks, for example, and you can use a pencil, or you could use a brush if you have that. So if you don't have a brush, that's okay. And this opaque gouache right here is going to allow me to kind of light my scene a little bit more dramatically, okay, by introducing some contrast. So that one's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to switch to this mild yellow paint. And with this, I can, again, just kind of hit a couple spots here, like so. And let's actually take this brush, get a little water on it, and now I can take this gouache, like so, and start to just hit it in a few places where I think we might want to improve our lighting, okay? Also a little too saturated for what I want to do here. So I'm going to jump to a little bit of white, and maybe we'll mix this white. You can always just grab, with this stuff, just grab a scrap piece of marker paper, maybe fold it a couple times like so, and then once you've popped your ink seal here, or not your ink, but your paint seal, like so, pop. Now I have white on the tip, and we'll just squeeze a little bit onto this paper, and now I can actually mix my colors a little bit. So if I want something that is a little bit lighter, but in the yellow ochre family here, I'm just gonna mix these two together, these two paints, like so, until I get something light enough to really help with lighting my rocks and my pasture, okay? So don't be afraid to apply these opaque paints or inks, things like that to your scene, because it'll really just help things pop a bit more. Okay, so there we go, and hopefully you can kind of see, not trying to be too detailed with this, but rather using the paint to enhance the contrast in the scene, okay? And like I said, just in this valley section here, some nice hits of the paint will kind of help with the lighting in the scene, like so. Okay, so we'll just keep painting this in, working it like so. It's always handy to have some water nearby, so I have this little container of water, and you can see that just by adding this gouache with the white, the yellow with the white, I'm able to keep kind of earth tones, but also go a little bit lighter. So even on these rocks, okay, as I had them here, just adding this gouache for lighting purposes, you can kind of see how this is really starting to just pop quite a bit more, like so. All right. Maybe just a tiny bit of water. I don't like to add a ton of water to my gouache because it does kind of dilute it. It does make it flow a little bit better, but in diluting it, I also dilute the opaqueness of the ink, and I want to kind of preserve that as I'm going. So just on these fence posts as well, I'm going to take some of the same gouache and apply that where we had applied our pencil. Continue to help the contrast on these because our lightest lights against our darkest darks are going to help things read a bit more in terms of depth or detail and so forth. Okay, and as we get closer, that's where we'd want to maybe focus a little bit more on the details of what we're doing so that it does seem or feel like this is truly in perspective and we have a nice kind of value difference between foreground and background. All right, so there we have a bit of green. We have some gouache added. You know, maybe that's a bit of snow. Maybe it's just the rocks that are a little bit lighter, but the point is creating the value difference and contrast so that we now have something that reads a lot more like a landscape scene. So continuing to use the gouache, we can add some green here, brown, whatever color we need to add to kind of help with our translucent marker. We can add that to the scene. So pretty handy. It's also fairly cheap if you're looking to buy some or try it out. I got this set, I believe, for about $9 or $10 and has about 25 pigments in there. So something you can try out if you're interested. Just play around with it, mix colors, all that good stuff. And again, by using the gouache, I'm able to have a little bit higher saturation. Well, not higher saturation, but more contrast up front in my scene as I'm using it, okay? And it's a little bit saturated here. So you can also take your finger, kind of brush it a little bit. But I'm actually going to use some black to blend with this green, just a little bit, to kind of help things out. So a little bit on my pencil there. And let's just throw it on the paper. If you do have a palette, definitely works a little bit better than my paper, but I don't have a palette. I don't paint a ton. So this is just me working with what I have. And I'm actually going to add some blue to the gouache as well because I want my shadows to be a little bit cooler in appearance and color. So a little bit of blue gouache to kind of help as well. So mix some blue with this black and green. And now we have a nice tone here that I can really lean into, maybe on the back side of some of these rock formations here. Just like that. Tiny bit of water. Not too much because we're working with marker paper and it's fairly delicate. We don't want it, you know, oversaturated with water. So just going to add a little bit of that green and make sure we bring it into the scene just a little bit in terms of the color. Okay. Just like so. Just like that. All right. Just wash this side as well. Okay. All right, well, what about the sky? We did fill it in with blue. And if we want to add some clouds, it's really hard to do if there's already blue there. So fortunately, we do have white gouache, okay? And we can use one of these brushes. Let's see here. So we got this brush that I have, and I'm gonna grab my gouache. I'm always losing things. I don't know where it is right now, but I'll grab my other gouache here. And now with this pure white, I'm just gonna dip the brush directly in. I can touch up some of the highlights in my scene You know, if I want there to be something brighter happening, I can do that, like so. But I can also paint in some clouds. So for that, I'm just gonna experiment here, a little bit of water, and maybe something like this. Just kind of paint these in. Maybe a couple streaky clouds here. I know there's happy trees, but I'm not sure about happy clouds. So my Bob Ross knowledge is failing me a little bit. But we've got some clouds here in the sky. Just a couple little white spots, like so. Build that up as necessary. And again, squint your eyes kind of helps you focus on the overall effect and less on the detail of what you're doing. So that's just something that personally helps me, and you can also try out yourself if you're working on something like this. All right. And just a little bit of water here will kind of help the ink flow, or not the ink, the paint. I'm so used to ink, but help the paint flow a little bit more with my clouds, like so. Maybe just a couple more spots. I'm not an expert on clouds, so forgive me if these aren't exactly scientific, but just looking for the overall effect on my clouds here. And so now that I have this, I'm just taking a bit more of the opaque, and on the top, or where I feel like there needs to be a little bit more contrast, I can add that in. Now on the horizon line, I did have this gray, but just above where the ground starts, I'm gonna paint in with my white just a little bit, like so, and then take some water. Let's actually wash this out. Just take a little bit of water, kind of wash this, because right above the horizon line, you're gonna get almost a little lighter tone in your sky, and I want to try and mimic or capture that. So just with a little bit of water over our base marker, we can lighten that up just a little bit, and again, where necessary, just kind of hit things with a little bit of that extra white or yellow, you know, to kind of help this out, and it's just going to help things pop a lot more. Okay. All right. So I'm going to call it good right here, but overall, I feel like we did a pretty good job of using our markers, pencils, a little bit of paint to kind of create this landscape scene with what we have. Again, you can always use some pencil in the case of this tree, and maybe make things a little bit darker where they need to be. Okay, especially in this kind of shadowed area. And it'll also help me differentiate between the main tree and the shadow it's casting. But these are all things you can try. I like to say there's always a fix no matter what. So if you're just trying something for the first time, try not to stress about it. Just have fun and really think about the nature of the tools, paper, so forth. And that's going to help you kind of decide on an approach that works for you. And with that, you can try new things like this. Like, I've never actually done a landscape scene with marker, so pretty fun. Thanks for watching and being a part of this with me. Well, thanks for watching, guys. I had fun, and I hope you did. And be sure, again, to subscribe, turn on alerts, otherwise you won't know when I post. And if you want to interact, come say hi on Instagram. I post there quite often. And check out sketchaday.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter. Well, that's it for today, and we'll see you next time right here on Sketchaday.